to episode 4 of On the Air with ICA, our new podcast and web discussion series. My name is Lara Sawyer. I'm the executive director of the International Communication Association. We are a nonprofit working to advance the scholarly study of human communication by encouraging and facilitating excellence in academic research worldwide. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. in the US, but we have over 5,000 members in over 80 countries around the globe. As you know by now, the idea for this web series and now accompanying audio podcast came from an aha moment I had after reading a series of articles called Left to Their Own Devices, which was on the platform Medium, covering various topics surrounding teaching during a pandemic, authored by professors Vicky Katz and Amy Jordan, both at Rutgers University. This is the 4th episode in our series. Prior episodes that are available online and wherever podcasts are available included deans discussing how to support early career scholars systemically during the pandemic, and a discussion with professors who are also parents. And we're having a discussion later today with journal editors on the challenges of doing that job during a global pandemic. So we're sort of hitting this from all different angles. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's discussion, which is episode 4 of our series entitled Surviving and Thriving, Advising Students Through a Pandemic. We have a wonderful group of both students and mentors here today to discuss this, and I'm going to quickly introduce each of you who is with us this morning in alphabetical order. When I do that, if you can please give both a wave and an audible greeting when I greet you, so that those who are watching or just listening to audio later can identify you either way. So we have Dr. Shakuntala Banaji, Professor of Media, Culture, and Social Change and Program Director for the Masters in Media Communication and Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Banaji, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Laura.
Myrene Magabo is a doctoral student at the University of the Philippines Open University and serves as an ICA student and early career board representative. Myrene, always good to see you.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Dr. Mary Beth Oliver is a distinguished professor of media studies at the Penn State College of Communications, where she is also the co-director of the Media Effects Research Laboratory. Mary Beth, good morning.
Hello, nice to be here.
Dr. Jessica Taylor Piotrowski is a professor and director of the Graduate School of Communication at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Jessica, thank you so much for making time for this.
To be here, thanks so much.
Kate Prindella is a doctoral student at the Rutgers School of Communication and Information. Kate, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. Good morning.
Dr. Meghan Sanders is associate professor and the director of the Media Effects Lab at the Louisiana State University Manship School of Communication. Meghan, always a pleasure.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Sure. Lara Shrewers is a PhD student at the School for Mass Communication Research at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Lara, so great you could be here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you all so much for making the time for this conversation. We know things are hectic all the time now, and you can never really escape work or home. So we really appreciate you giving an hour to us. We're so grateful. Lastly, I am honored to introduce our moderator for this discussion, the co-author of the Medium series I mentioned before, which inspired this web series, Dr. Amy Jordan, the chair of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University and past president of the International Communication Association, and one of my very favorite people. Amy, I will turn it over to you.
Wow, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are representing people from, all over the world and across various time zones. So it's really impressive what you've been able to do, Laura, to get everyone together and, to gather us together in this forum. And it's also just such a pleasure, especially in times when we're all so distant, physically distant, but also, we're disconnected from our colleagues and from our students, to have this opportunity to be together and to do some brainstorming. And, I've been worrying a lot about how one can be an effective advisor when one is in the middle of a pandemic, right? So as much as I worry about being an effective advisor, I also worry about what is it like to be a student, during these times. And, we kind of set up the Medium series as a discussion about sort of pedagogy and learning during a pandemic, but we also have to recognize that we're at a time around the world where we're dealing with multiple crises at once, right? You know, racial justice issues, economic crises, climate crises. So I think it's important that we all take a step back and say, what is it that we can do to address the needs, but also make sure that we're listening, right? So that the students have an opportunity to listen to their advisors, and the advisors have an opportunity to listen to the students. And you know, one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of the challenges of being socially distant is that we just don't have that opportunity to run into each other in the halls anymore, right? You know, where we used to run into a student and say, hey, how's it going? You know, what's happening? How are you? And then, you know, maybe informally proceed into a discussion about, you know, project they're working on, or their fall's preparation, or their dissertation progress. Now it all feels so formal, right? And so I think that's a challenge. But I also really miss having the opportunity to talk to my colleagues about their ideas for how they're bringing students along. So I wanted to focus on two main themes in our conversation today. One having to do with this question of, what do students really need now that helps them in terms of their progress in their work? And secondly, what are students thinking about that takes them beyond finishing their dissertations and moving into a job market with so many uncertainties? And wrapped up in all of that are the very real physical concerns that we all have, but also the mental health and the emotional concerns. So I thought I'd open it up to students first to see whether or not there are things that rise to the top where you think it would be good to unpack those first. And it really can be anything, but we want to make sure that we start off the conversation with what you see as your priorities. And if I'm looking off to the side, it's because I'm taking frantic notes.
Okay, I have something to say if I may start. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you for this introduction. I think it really hits the points that are the most difficult now with the informal interactions. I think one thing that is, that with which I am suffering, and many of my colleague students are also suffering with, is the stress about not finishing the PhD in time. Like, there are many data collections that had to be postponed or even couldn't go through, and you're also not motivated anymore like before to work every day on your research because you're all the time at home. So this stress is like always present, I feel, about the research that we are doing. And it's also not always clear for students what the expectations now are, because many say like, the expectations are adapted now. You shouldn't worry too much about this, but what is then still expected from you? What are the deadlines that you do need to meet? What are the ones that you can postpone? Like, these things are really important to be very clear, I think, to relieve this stress a little bit about finishing that dissertation. So that is, I think, for me, the most important thing that is always present, already now almost a year from working from home. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that this issue of finishing the dissertation is internal, right? I want to get this done, I want to get this done,
Yeah.
but then there are the external pressures of my funding's ending, and
Exactly.
what happens when that. Mm-hmm. Other students who want to weigh in with their priorities or issues?
Maybe I can chip in my thoughts.
Yes, Myrene.
I definitely concur with Laura, how the pandemic has given us that sense of stress and takes us away from our focus. The only difference is that I am used to working online with organizations and teaching online, as well as I am an online student. So the adjustment could be 50%. It's more of here in the US, you're excited about what's going on with the politics, and you're living here, and each day a little bit of your time is taken away from your focus. And I really struggled to finish up with my own dissertation, and luckily I was able to defend it. And I love that you pointed out questions such as how can advisors help and support the students. And in my case, I feel that when an advisor is not just reaching out, but also giving you that sense of dependence, not giving you the panic, but not pressing the panic button on you, but just telling you that I'm here whenever you need me, and that we're very supportive of what you're doing. That really gives us a push and a motivation to pursue what we're doing. And then guiding us with a few words such as, oh, you're working well on this area, and then these are the things that you need to further work on. Being specific on these things could really help the student focus and have that direction where to go. And that kind of advising really helped me through. So it's not just pushing you to do something, but also guiding you well to the right direction. So thank you so much for bringing this up. And we really need this as students to really finish our work. Now, the second area, maybe we'll talk about that later, how to transition from being a doctorate student now or an early scholar to getting that full-time job. Mm-hmm. So that this is awesome. I really thank you for this opportunity.
Good. Others who might want to jump in?
Yeah, I think a lot of what's been said so far really resonates in terms of just different capacities during a pandemic, where the amount that we maybe used to be able to do is not what we can do anymore. But also anxieties around just getting stuff done, or like funding running out, and trying to find funding during a pandemic when everyone is cutting back on things that they're funding. All just really resonates, where I think that I agree with a lot of what's been said around advisors being like understanding, mainly I think is key, of they're going through it too. So hopefully they would extend some just flexibility to students. And beyond that, I think really being a student's advocate is always important for an advisor, but especially during a pandemic when other things come up, or like you fall behind on your schedule, or trying to get them access to like alternative fundings, alternative sources of the resources that they need to be able to finish. Where I think especially for a lot of students, or at least I know I'm coming up on the end of my funding this year, where the added stress on top of the pandemic you're writing, and you're trying to get things done, but also now having to look for other resources just to get you through and be able to survive. I think an advisor being aware of that is key all of the time, but especially in this added weight of the pandemic.
Yeah, those are very, very helpful suggestions. I wanted to speak with those who are in positions now of advising students to see whether or not there are particular issues that have come up over and over for you, but also whether or not you've had any opportunities to deploy solutions, or at least have thought of things that maybe you could do that could potentially be helpful.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
So yeah, I've had I think I advise lots of master's students as well as doctoral students, and every single one is at a different stage and have been over the course of the year. So we have a one-year master's program. So when the first lockdown struck in London here where I am, it was a complete shock to everybody. No one was prepared. There was no sense of preparation. And that's partly because the country was not prepared. And it's also partly because everything had seemed so normal and all the warnings from China had been ignored. I already had doctoral students who'd passed out of the course warning us from China that we have been put online. We've been teaching online since January and nobody here had taken heed of that. So I think there's three things to say. And I'd really like to sort of make the points in tandem because they're all related to each other. One, you pretty much have to do the same thing in a pandemic that you do at any other point in your advising career, which is you have to be this really compassionate, humane, and also guiding and insightful person on whom all of these people can depend. But you have to keep your boundaries so that you don't burn out. And that tension is there in the neoliberal education sector. It's been there for the last 10 to 15 years. It isn't something new. And if one has learned anything over these years about how to navigate that, then one is that kind of advisor. And I think compassion here is the key thing, because I know a lot of very brilliant advisors, but I know fewer who have a consistent strain of compassion in how they treat all of their students at whatever level they're doing dissertations or undergraduate or postgraduate. The second thing to say is we're a group of people here who are all women at the moment. That for me is really disturbing. I was disturbed when I first came in and saw that. And I'm also disturbed generally when I hear students talk about the differential burdens of caring in terms of how they go to advisors. And so another thing to say is that if you happen to be someone who's known as a caring professor or someone who does do a lot of the reassurance, it can play out quite differently for those of us who are women and feminists, those who don't think in those ways, and for some of our male colleagues. And I think that is also the case in terms of young male graduate students. And so one of the things I've developed over the years, and which has really stood my students in good stead over the pandemic, is right from the get-go, getting them to have a sense of community, whether they're male or female, and getting them to contribute and connect to each other so that I don't burn out in supporting them, but that I can always call on one of the network points amongst the 50 or so students that I have on any given year to support in that particular way, to call on them to support each other. And so they have this network where some people are closer to other people. It's completely organic in the sense that I don't put people into groups, but we do have Telegram groups where we connect to each other. And that's what we started doing almost the moment the lockdown happened for the first time. So we had repeated chats, both individually, privately with each other, and me with the whole group. And that was not an academic experience. That was us sending each other ludicrous jokes about politicians and the kinds of things that people were saying, also critiquing the strategies of our institution. I mean, I think being able to be critical openly about one's institution and to remain on the side of the students in these moments is really important. And I've seen, and even I suffer from, a lot of shutdown when colleagues don't want to critique the institution, but we know the institution is doing something that is actually really wrong with our doctoral students, and especially at a time when a lot of them are losing their jobs. So, you know, any incomes that people have had have been disappearing. So this community and connection, I think, is the second thing that I would emphasize. And that's something that one does anyway, but that one has to do doubly in a pandemic, but not all oneself. It should not be a kind of cult thing where you alone are the star connecting to lots of individual students. It should be a thing where you are part of that group. And I will honestly say that I get an enormous amount of strength from the students and from the way in which they connect to me and the care that they have taken during the pandemic. And the last and third thing to say is the one I think that Myrene brought up, but I think Kate also mentioned, which is about transitioning into work and being given opportunities to work. And there I feel like I will say I'm a fierce mama bear to every single one of my students, and wherever there is a chance to get them anything and paid work of any kind, and I really mean paid work because there's far too much of that unpaid labor going around at the moment, I will do it. And I will, whatever it takes, if I'm writing a reference for someone at 2 a.m. because we only heard about the thing 2 days ago, that's what I'll do, whatever it takes. And I think I'll do that more now during the pandemic than I would have before. So all of those things about, oh, submit this, to me now so that I have 21 days to write your reference have really gone out the window for me. So in that, although I keep strong boundaries in other areas, in that I think I'm much more lenient, and I'm writing references sort of right up to the deadline for people.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to contribute a little bit. So I'm also mentoring a range of students. So I'm the director of the graduate school. So I have many master students that are in some way that I'm a mentor for, but I also have doctoral students that are in different stages of their career. And the truth of the matter is I'm not sure there's a one size fits all answer, but that probably makes the most sense. And as comm scholars, it's probably the thing we would all agree on. But what I have found is that I have needed to bring in more structure in my mentoring in order to be able to help my students, but also protect myself, because this is such a challenging space for everyone. So structure is defined differently depending upon my student to some extent, their own needs, but it usually involves right now, for example, for a key example would be weekly meetings with my PhD students. I might have done less before, but I find now because I don't have those hallway contact moments, I need more in my agenda. And even if there's nothing to discuss that week about research, I want to keep the meeting because I want the touch points just with the student. And so but what I've done is what I heard from our PhDs was, and maybe this is some of the students may feel this way, was with the pandemic, it's so easy to lose structure and also to lose sort of motivation. And so with that, I asked my PhDs to provide an agenda in advance of the meeting and also to provide a recap afterwards so that, and then we have action steps. And if there is no agenda, they'll write that and then we'll still have a conversation on how things are going. And in these conversations, I really try to practice, I really love the word compassion. I think this is something, so in my structure, there really needs to be compassion. And I find that that's very natural for me as a human being, but I want to echo it more verbally now, right? Because I don't have the nonverbal cues the same way. So I really try to listen very carefully in that space. And again, that sensitivity is very different depending upon the student, what their unique situation is. And as much as they're willing to share, that's their own boundaries, I try to be sensitive and really remember that. I also think that the biggest difference for me has been, usually as a mentor, I'm seen as the person that maybe knows a bit more, has a bit more experience, can offer feedback on their writing or their ideas or their scholarship. And all of that remains true. But I don't have any feedback on how to survive in a pandemic. I've never done it before. I'm actually not sure about how some days I realize I've sat in my chair all day and think I didn't even get 10,000 steps today. And then I'm thinking, this is a new rule I need to make for myself. And I'm learning just like my students are about how to do this. And so for the first time in a long while, I'm practicing on what I would say learning together. And so giving us space to hear different ideas and being very honest that I also don't really know what I'm doing sometimes and I'm figuring it out. And when something's happening political wise, for example, I'm also struggling and I'm trying to be honest with my students about this so that they understand that this is a normal experience to have. And that's part of the way I'm practicing compassion, but also trying to learn together. So I think key points for me would certainly be structure and whatever that looks like, practicing compassion, making sure that compassion is really tailored to my different students' needs, and being open and willing to say out loud, I'm learning and let's learn together in this. And so there's some of the things, and I'm still learning. So I'm hoping to learn more today actually on what else to do.
Thank you, Jenna.
I'll jump in just because many of the thoughts I had have already been brought up here in slightly different forms. So I think a lot of the approaches that we use are likely reflective of the different methodological approaches that we have too. And as a social scientist, co-authorship is a very, very common thing. So this might be specific to the kind of work that I do, but along the lines of compassion is, I think it's really important that we work on creating and maintaining a sense of community. And so when I reflect back on my grad school, I mean, I am really good friends with all of the people I went to school with still. And and that's because we hung out together, we collaborated together. And so creating this sense of community, I think, is huge. And I have all of my graduate students, we have a common lab group now, and so we meet together once a week. And I noticed that if I'm a little bit late on Zoom, I have it set up that they can just come in, and if I walk in and they've been there 5 minutes, they're just, sharing a lot. And I think that that's important. And we're also trying to figure out ways to actually get together in person by doing fun things that are not academic, going around hikes in the neighborhood. So that's one thing I would say. The other is getting creative with the resources that we need to get our work done. And a lot of social scientists, they're collecting data with human beings as participants in their work. And so how do we make that transition? And how do we look at other tools that we can use to facilitate their collection of data? And that means that I am often, I'm not familiar with those tools. And so hearkening back to what Jessica was saying, learning together, and you were talking about managing a pandemic, but I've been trying to say, hey, look, here's a new web scraping tool, and I don't know how to use it, but let's learn it together, to try to have fun together in that research process. And then the last one, and this one I would love to hear your ideas about, because I'm not sure how best to do it, but I think that a big important role that I normally play with my grad students is helping them network and meet people in the field. And, that's tougher. Well, in a way it's tougher, but in a way maybe it's easier since we can just communicate through Zoom. But I would love to hear ideas about how to help my students network and meet other people in the field.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Meghan?
Yeah, a lot of the comments that I initially had have been said in different ways so far. I heard it said, I think it was on Twitter, someone made the comment, we're not working from home, we're living at work. And that's very much what it feels like for many of us, especially for our students. And I've been challenged by the idea of mentoring students across the years that they're in within their program. So there are a lot of conversations about helping our PhD students and master students finish their degree programs, but we also have students who are in the middle of their programs and students who are just beginning their program, and they expected an entirely different start to their educational experience that they're not getting. And so I find myself kind of challenged by the idea of how do I mentor students across where they are within their educational experience, but also kind of balancing the difference between the students who want structure and who want to try to proceed as though we are in pre-pandemic times, and the students who want as much flexibility as we can possibly give them, because those are very different things. And mapping that on top of where the students are in their program makes it even more challenging. And so what I've tried to do, although not very successfully at times, is try to set up what the mutual expectations are, not just what my expectations are, but what are you looking for yourself as a student? What kind of community are you looking to set up? What do you need from me? Also in terms of timelines. So we still have to progress and we still have work that we need to do, but setting up timelines and deadlines with flex dates is something that I'm toying with. So we have this deadline of maybe 2 weeks from now, but maybe there's this 3 or 4 day grace period, because we don't know what's actually going to happen in the world around us. We have definitely seen that happen time and time again in the last year, where we think that we may be able to meet a deadline, but then something happens that takes our focus away from the work at hand. And that deadline just doesn't matter quite as much anymore. So I'm toying with the idea of flex dates with the deadlines, especially with the collaborative projects that I have with students. I also have a research group like Mary Beth. And that was something that we struggled with in the fall semester. How do we keep moving forward? How do we keep moving, getting projects completed when we have so many different issues and concerns and responsibilities that are floating around us? Some of us are parents, some of us are not. Some of us have parents that we are taking care of. Some of us are not. Some of us have friends that we're concerned about, family members that we're concerned about, colleagues that we're concerned about. Some of us have never even stepped foot in the library just yet. And we're trying to figure out how to use things from afar. So how do we manage all of that? And I think someone mentioned it already, but being honest about where we are is incredibly important. I think that it helps model healthier behaviors for students when they are aware that there are things that we are struggling with as well. I have told students, guess what? I haven't worn shoes in a week because I haven't stepped foot outside of the house. And that's just the reality that I'm in. And sometimes you may get emails from me at 3 a.m. It's not because I'm on call 24/7. It's because I'm having trouble sleeping right now. And that is my reality. How are you doing? Are your sleeping patterns okay? And so I think just kind of modeling the humanity, which is so often missing from the educational experience pre-pandemic. I think it's easy for us to go about our day-to-day, and students maybe have the misperception that it looks a little easier or a lot easier than it actually is. I think this has actually given us an opportunity to really share with our students the totality of what our profession and our field actually looks like and how to navigate through that in a more humane way.
That's so important. It reminds me of, there's a saying that you shouldn't compare your own behind the scenes footage to other people's highlight reel. And I think a lot of times students see you as this like super actualized, amazing, prolific professor who has this CV that's so long and you're where they want to be someday. And they think it was all easy for you because they see how successful you are and they look up to you. And I think it's so important. I mean, and this is the same for, I'm not a professor, but I have young people on my staff. It's the same sort of relationship, and sharing with them how difficult your own rise was, but also how difficult it still is for you, so that they know that they're only seeing your highlight reel is I think such a strong way to bond with people and to empower people to step into their own power and influence later.
I will comment on that though. It's been interesting to me because I'm as a director, I also work with all of our teachers. And one of the things early on in the pandemic, and this was a mistake I learned from early on, I had said to the teachers, let's make sure we're reaching out. Let's make sure we're connecting, share your experiences, let them feel the humanity of all of this. Like you can define your flexibility, but let them connect. And a few teachers, rightfully so, emailed me back and said, either one, that crosses a boundary I don't feel comfortable with my own sharing, which I actually respect. And others saying, I'm actually so maxed right now on my emotional bandwidth. I'm not sure I can have the share back right now because of my own personal situation. Yeah. And both of those, I thought, wow, me practicing this, everybody gets unique messages. Here I am sending my teachers, please do this, without really having the nuance that I know to have, but because of the pandemic and me trying to respond quickly, I thought, you know what, you're absolutely right. Let me respond more carefully. Let me do this better. And it was really a key learning moment for me. And one of the things I've been advising my colleagues as we talk about this very openly is that our PhDs, for example, have a committee usually. They're not usually mentored by one person. There's maybe an advisor, a co-advisor, maybe someone else. Usually what I say is maybe you can talk in the committee, who's the person that can be that a bit more support role, because maybe it doesn't fit everyone's personality or unique home situations, and finding those balance. And that's been really helpful for self-protection too, for different faculty members who needed it. So recognizing that who's going to be that person. We also have put in mentors in our program for our PhDs. So we have confidential mentors who are not on their committee. These are just people in our faculty who have said, I have the emotional bandwidth now to be a person that they can go to and speak with about anything. And so if you're a faculty member at the moment who you feel you just don't have it for whatever reason, you can still kind of set that up too. So I also think institutionally, we can keep in mind, we're all sitting here saying, yeah, that's been hard for us too. All of us are struggling in our own ways. And so there's only so much we can, the put your own mask on first sort of thing is often what I'm thinking. And so institutionally, things we can build in that help us all be able to do this, I think is important too.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important point that you make, Jess, that as much as we all think about the need for creating communities for students, there's also a need to create communities for faculty. And I know in my own institution, there has been an emphasis on let's share best practices for teaching remotely, but there hasn't been any similar sort of effort for let's talk together about how to advise remotely and share ideas about what we can do there in that capacity. I want to get to another point that several of you have raised about adjusting expectations. So Meghan, you talked about the need to build in a grace period for deadlines. Mary Beth, you talked about the need to say, well, if your dissertation is in need of this sort of data, let's learn together what kind of data scraping tools might be available. One of the things that I'm hoping as a community of scholars, particularly as students are finishing, which you will, and getting out into the world and looking for jobs, are the adjusting expectations that we as a field really need to make. Some of us who got our degrees a long, long time ago will sometimes say, oh, I got my first assistant professor job when I was ABD and had one publication, right? So that was la la land, but it also reflected, a time where it took a long time to go to a library and pull down journals off a shelf and Xerox the journal articles and format. It was a slower pace. Just like now, it's a slower pace, right? Even though we have all the technologies to be able to do it. So I think one of the things that we can do as advocates for our students is to make sure that as we are sending them out into the world, writing the letters of recommendation, at the nth hour, which I would agree, Shakuntala, that I'm doing the same thing, right? Students will say, I have an application that's due in 2 days, and I'll drop everything because I know that that's how it's coming up. But making sure that we're emphasizing to our colleagues the effect of the pandemic on students. So I'm hoping with that comment, we can pivot to a conversation about setting our students up so that as they're finishing their work, they're prepared to launch into new spaces. And I know one of the things that ICA has talked a lot about, and that the dean's conversation that I had earlier, is this notion that there aren't going to be the same number of academic tenure track positions that there were 2 years ago, in part because of the contraction of universities, but also because now there's this waiting line, right? So people who finished and now are continuing to build their CVs. So if you're fresh out, it's going to be a little bit harder. So we've been thinking about what are the alternative paths or careers for PhDs. And I do think that that's one place where we as advisors can stop trying to replicate ourselves and say the only good job is a tenure track job at a Research One institution now. So I wanted to see if you have thoughts about ways to advise students around that, if that's something they're open to, and ways to connect students to those spaces. Again, if that's something they're interested in.
Well, first, we have to make sure that we don't suggest that academia is the only golden standard. And that should be something that I think, at least in my mentoring, has always been true in myself, but I think it's an important thing to recognize that the use of a PhD goes far beyond if you stay in academia or not. So many places and spaces around the world value and benefit from the research skills that a PhD provides. And so having those open dialogue with your students about what are the numerous different places that their training might take them is a really important part, and making sure that they don't feel like they have to talk in the closet about looking outside of academia, like it's a secret thing, but that it's a very open. And then the secondary point, when you start seeing if other spaces are interest, what I've been doing actually is I'm taking a bit advantage of the pandemic and saying, where are the conferences or groupings for these other, like, no, academia is not the only group that has conferences, right? In fact, usually the other ones have better swag. And what I've been encouraging them to do is find out, sorry, Lara, we're getting better, but what I've been encouraging them to do is find these different spaces, because right now they're all online and they're often very affordable. So what I'm allowing is for my students at a very affordable rate to be able to go to other, perhaps industry conferences that they can do from their computer, and say, it's okay if you're not writing for 2 days this week on your dissertation because you're attending this, tell me what you saw. I'm interested to hear what was inspiring to you. So I think that that's a nice thing that at this small moment we can encourage. I also think being really thoughtful in our letters, the time it takes to write these letters, we all know, but now more than ever they matter. I think we can do it better. We have to be, as our own role on committees, we need to be speaking up on committees and recognizing that there's going to be a very interesting pattern happening on CVs right now. And this is going to be something we have to be, when we're screening, I think also very well aware of too. So directing your students, but also having conversations. We're in positions in our faculty where we can talk about that, and we should consider those. And maybe reflect differently on what sort of space or place you have in creating new positions. We've started a new position in my department where it's a combination of, we're able to fund it primarily through our teaching institute budget. We have a very high enrollment of students, but we can give them a little bit of research time too, which is not something, so it's not an assistant professor position, but it's a postdoc with research, lecturing, primary lecture and research time to help as stepping stones. So also considering what stepping stone positions we may need to facilitate our teaching right now, but also can give them a benefit. So there's some ideas.
Frequently, I think it's important to remember that many of our students, I don't know whether your institution has, huge fees, but many of our students are quite a lot in debt when they finish their work. So anyway, we often have a conversation about whether going into an adjunct role, which will lead to a tenure track role, is something that they can afford to do when they're directly out of the program. And so the 4 destinations, of course, that we encourage our students to take are advocacy, policy, industry, and academia, but there are other ones. So for instance, I have students who've gone into trade union roles, which I suppose you could call advocacy, but it's something slightly more campaign oriented. There's a whole range of students of mine who've taken 2 or 3 years out to do completely other things. One of them went and taught yoga for 3 years because the sheer volume and stress of the work at the end of the PhD was so enormous that I think he himself needed something else in order to come back to academia, and has now come back to it. Keeping that network of former students coming back and talking to the current students and the finishing students to say, look, I'm really happy. So I have a student who became an adjunct, worked as an adjunct for a year, was incredibly pressurized, didn't get paid very well, and is now working as a policy advisor for a tech company and doing incredibly well and feeling much more stimulated by their job and having a lot more space. And they'll do that, and then they'll come back to academia at some point with a much richer sense of what they can bring. So I don't think it's really the case that this has changed in the pandemic as far as our institution is concerned, or I myself as an advisor are concerned. But I do worry that there is a shrinking job space in all these fields, not just within academia. And I do worry that we might end up pointing people towards things which pay very low money for a long period of time, and at the end of which they then haven't got publications. So I will say lastly, and I know we've talked a lot about the balance between pressure and loose deadlines, I am still in touch with people from 4 years ago, encouraging them to get those publications and get that book out, even when they are working for a completely different kind of organization. So the one thing I will say is that it's really important that when students are near to finishing or are finishing, whatever their destination, that they are still using all of the resources that they already worked so hard on and turning those into something which could, if they wish, become a kind of capital. And I don't think it ever hurt anyone's CV to have 3 good journal articles or a book on there, whether they're working for a, a publishing company or for a university or for a movement. So I think getting those parallel tracks going is really important.
Yeah, I would also like to add, sometimes it can be quite, not so straightforward to talk with your supervisor about a job outside academia, because of course, these are the persons that chose academia. So it's sometimes a bit weird to have that discussion. So I think it's really important what Jessica also said, to be allowed to follow these conferences that are industry-based, or talk with other former PhD students that left academia and talk about their experiences. This may be even now more important than otherwise. Like a supervisor just set up some meeting with some other former PhD students that left academia. You can just chat about what you can do, because it's more informal maybe than talk about your supervisor that you want to leave academia because they've chosen it, of course. So that might feel a bit strange there.
Actually, Lara, it's funny you mentioned that. I think last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, maybe it was last year, there was a Blue Sky workshop that someone did at ICA on jobs outside of academia. And I think it was one of the most well-attended Blue Skies, if I remember. Am I right about that, Lara?
It was very popular.
Yeah, and I think
that a lot of people were like, wait, I can do that?
Exactly. But I think that's, if we're thinking about things we can also do, and we're thinking about, even our own upcoming ICA meeting and things like that, where we bring people together, because to Lara's point, coming to me might not be the best person for me to say, here's all of your options, because I didn't take that trajectory. I mean, I know some people that I would refer you to. And so that can also be a space as a community that we try to pull. Who were the people that took these also excellent tracks, and finding ways that they can give advice. So I think that's a bigger takeaway that we could also think of.
We've had several grad students, they're allowed to do internships. Now, and typically they're not just, the unpaid labor internship. I mean, there are internships that have been in industry that often pay, and on a couple of occasions, they have been offered a job right then and there at the internship, and we're like, no, but come back and just finish that dissertation. Can you ask them the whole lot? I don't know if that's very common to allow that to be for course credit, and it's often in the summer. But I think maybe that would be something that would be helpful for us, for our program, and maybe others, to really look to consolidate the many opportunities that are for people with more advanced degrees, like our grad students.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I know it's something that happened at my former institution, that there would be summer internships, but there was funding provided. So one of the concerns that I have is, if we say you can do this internship for credit, but it's in New York, DC, LA, wherever it is, if there isn't funding, it might create further disparity. But
Sure.
It's something that we could certainly advocate for in our own institutions, to say, we're not spending money on sending students to conferences. I mean, we are sending them to virtual conferences like ICAs, but we're not paying for them to fly to Australia, right? So I think it could be a very good use of that money, if it still exists in departmental budgets, to shift that.
If I can say something,
yeah,
I believe that student members in ICA are very, very lucky, early career scholars, because right now, especially with the link that we have, where there's a public discussion and you can see a lot of job openings being offered there or being announced there. All we need to do, I believe right now, especially with us, lucky members of ICA, is to tap whatever resources ICA is providing us. And there's a lot of resources there for networking as well as for finding jobs. So right now, the link is such a great opportunity for all of us students.
Yeah.
Early career scholars in ICA.
I absolutely agree. And I find that great to hear that you feel that way. I would actually think one thing that we could also be thinking of, I'm just brainstorming out loud here, is one of my students recently asked me what her CV should look like for a non-academic job application. And I actually wasn't quite certain, to be honest with you. I'm on a lot of committees, but they're all in the academic space. Another one had asked me what the cover letter content maybe should look like. One of my students
send them to me.
Right. Well, that's exactly, Laurie. You would actually know exactly about when they're invited to give a 5-minute presentation, what's a way that they frame their work. Maybe that there's the little tips. I mean, they should still express who they are. It shouldn't be fake, but sometimes the tips we would give our students, and I think that this would be a really lovely resource that we could think of too for these other non-academic, what are the little differences? Many things are similar, but certain things are a bit different. And what are those norms and how do you shape your profile, which may be a perfect fit, but maybe there's little things that you just had to tweak to kind of get somebody to see you at the top of the pile.
Right.
And I think that's something that we could even maybe think of more.
Yes.
Yeah, good idea.
And I think especially in this moment, we can take it to look at like what we're setting students up for, like what the focus of their education is and what the focus of their education isn't, even beyond you getting to the after you finish, where do you go type of thing. Like I'm thinking specifically around like how much education, at least in my experience, is focused on like research and writing and not teaching, which even if a student does want to go into academia, there is usually a complete lack of pedagogy about how to teach and how to be a mentor and how to like be that advisor person, where then it just becomes this terrible cycle of people who weren't trained to do something and being thrust into that position of teaching and then not being able to help the new up and coming students, where like even for people who do want to go into academia, they're just not set up well with the resources they need in order to do that successfully, because it's been such a focus on research and then writing and then publication and not really the things around that also are a part of the job.
I think you bring up a good point, Kate, and it's something that I've been reflecting on a lot the last year in terms of how I'm advising students. We're so used to staying focused on the publication pipeline, the conference pipeline, and this is all great. And students are learning a lot through that process, but sometimes we kind of skirt the issue of certain skill sets and strengthening very specific skill sets and teaching our students how to talk about those skills in different ways. And while we're still maintaining that trajectory as best we can right now, the reality is a lot of journals, they have a backlog of pieces that need to be reviewed, and it's taking a longer period of time. And so while we're waiting, I find myself going back to my students and saying, okay, well, let's go back to the basics, things that we assume a lot of people know and should be strong in, but maybe they're not as strong as they could be. So let's talk about, how do we annotate articles? How do we take notes? How do we synthesize information? How do we build those skill sets within our students, and then actually teach them how to talk about those skill sets so that they can translate into those non-academic jobs as well, if that is an option that a student wants to pursue. So I find myself thinking a lot more about the basics and kind of taking the time more often with those basics and making sure that the students understand the process and the skills that they need to have moving forward research-wise.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, how, there are assumptions that students will just figure it out. They'll figure out how to teach, they'll figure out how to do reviews for conferences or journals, they'll figure out how to write a book review. So I really appreciate that. And that could be something that, as we're waiting for the pipeline to unclog and get our journal articles in, that's it's possibly something we could turn our attention to. Another fear that I have, particularly as so many conferences are going virtual and so many students have had their budgets cut so that they can't even attend the virtual conferences because the university won't pay the fee, is how do we promote our students and their, the brilliant work that they're doing amongst our colleagues when they can't present, or when we can't at a, departmental cocktail hour, pull our student over and say, oh, you need to meet such and such. So this isn't my idea, and I can't remember who to attribute to. I almost want to say it was you, Meghan, but someone came up with the idea of saying, my student is doing wonderful work in, just label it, and could give in your class a wonderful 10-15-minute presentation on this topic. And that, I think, could be a potential way to help reduce faculty burden, because now they have, new and interesting things to offer to their students, but also raise the visibility of students, particularly as they're getting closer to finishing their work. I don't know what the students feel about that, whether that feels a little scary, or whether that could be useful.
No, I believe it will be useful. It's going to be useful. And a student who participates in that could add the presentation itself or the published output itself to their portfolio, digital portfolio, or their credentials.
As an invited talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jessica, did I see on Twitter, I think I saw on Twitter this morning about a speaker, about a panel of early.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to say. This wasn't my ingenuity, but at ASCOR, yes, we've actually, one of the conversations at ASCOR, where I'm a part of UVA, in our research center, is that we notice that we often invite the creme de la creme scholars, and we want to hear all the people with the long CVs, and we have them come and give these great presentations. But we started realizing that there's actually this entire pool of yet to be discovered or early discovered talent, right? And we thought, why aren't we hearing from them? Because they're often doing, Mary Beth, you made the comment, I'll learn with you on how to do web scraping. Well, they are actually doing it first sometimes. Actually, this is a really great opportunity. And so we've actually started a new initiative where we're asking people to sort of find scholars that are, in their last year of their dissertation or early career, but are doing something different and new or exciting or just something inspiring in a different way, and asking them to present now as part of our new series. And I think that that's actually something in department levels, more of us could do. We could actually think about, because often our invitations at universities are often part of job searching, informally or not. We're thinking of people who might be applying for positions. Like, remove those thoughtful, just think about who's doing something interesting. What's the one paper that made you think, oh, I want to know more about that technique? And right now, we can do more of that because, well, we're doing it on Zoom. And so financially, it's possible. In terms of time management, it's possible. It raises visibility, and you actually benefit as a scholarly community for learning something interesting. So yeah, that's exactly what I was going to raise. Yeah.
I think one side effect of the pandemic too is that I'm seeing, and this is just anecdotal, I don't have data on this, but I saw this year a lot more student-led work accepted at ICA. I think part of that may be a function of, our acceptance rate was a little higher this year, but also I think people are just, some people are coming into their own and learning that they can expand topics that they maybe didn't expand before. But also, I know Mary Beth, there was a theme session that was led by a panel, led by a student on care, and it was accepted. And so this Davina, the student, she wrote to me and she was like, I've never done this before. What do I do? I was like, you're going to be great. And we can work through it, and she's so excited to have that opportunity just to sort of elevate and get that on her CV. And I think, that's a testament to Mary Beth too, to say, you know what, I'm going to give this a chance, because it's a panel. It's not a bunch of papers. And it's something we don't normally have as a student, actually leading a whole panel for a theme session, but I think it's going to be great.
I just wanted to say, Amy, that I think this question, it's really important not to just answer this in a sort of individualist way as an advisor. because it then falls down, because you can't give your students all of those opportunities, and also you want to give other people's students opportunities. So I think here is the point where institutions like ICA, or I'm in something called the London Screen Studies Group, or even a department can really pull up its socks and do something and do more than it's been doing before. So for instance, we in our department, we have a blog in which we put people's research, and it's often staff, but I think more and more we've had PhD students writing about their research, and even master students who've done a brilliant dissertation and want to transition to doing a PhD somewhere else. We invite them to write up a blog piece about their work, and it's a really beautiful blog. We also did a virtual exhibition, which was attended by both the public and by academics, in which it was, it was a bit strange and awkward to have a, poster exhibition in a virtual space, but you can make those kinds of things work. And then the London Screen Studies Group, face-to-face every single year, has a conference for doctoral students only, where staff attend kind of on a pro bono basis to just to be there and to mentor and to talk and chat about their work with the students, and the students present through the course of 2 or 3 days. And we did that this year, and it was unbelievably well attended from all over the world. So students who were still stuck in China, hadn't come to the UK, were there. There were students in, in Europe, students in the US. It was obviously very late at night for some people, but it worked very, very well. And I think more than 100 people learned about other people. Of course, you sometimes learn with shock that there's somebody else doing your exact same project. And, it's like a horrifying moment. But if it's a matter of funding, one shouldn't be relying on the old structures. If funding has dried up, make something new, and just make it work. But again, going back to the point several of our colleagues here have made, we have to protect our time. So if you do it as an individual, it's just impossible. You won't be able to keep making these opportunities for your students. If you do it as part of a network and different people volunteer time for different things, you can do such a range of stuff for PhD students, I think, at different stages of their careers, first years and, finishing students and just finished students.
And I know with ICA being so committed to our PhD students and our early career scholars, that you've made tremendous space for those voices and for a panel like this. But I know, Laura, you've also suggested that maybe this is a place where we can do that kind of clearinghouse of, who are the students who are ready to present their work in some sort of modified way to a larger audience that's maybe outside of the more formal confines of.
Yeah, I just took a note I was like, follow up with Shakuntala about the blog where people present their work, because I think that's a great idea. And the poster thing, it reminds me that last year, so we always have posters, and some people are like, oh, I just got accepted as a poster, I'm not coming. Well, last year, because we were virtual at the very last minute, we were able to allow people to do poster presentations. So instead of just like having, a piece of paper, they actually did 5-minute presentations. And so a lot of people said, I got more eyes on my poster this year than I ever have before. And it made it so much more valuable. And another thing that's happening this year is that we're, the Cadmore, a company that we're using for this year's virtual conference, ties everything directly. You'll upload your video directly to your Scholar One profile, so it goes to the exact right place and can't get lost, which is great. But also they are some of the leaders they were one of the first companies to actually do something where a video can be cited, so that actually like lives somewhere, and you can they'll give you the citation information, so you could put that in your CV, not just as I presented at this conference, but here's my presentation and you can watch it, which I think is helpful to people.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So I think we've come to the end of our hour, and I wanted to again thank you for all taking this time across various time zones and through various perspectives. I know I've learned a lot. I've been taking notes like Laura furiously, and I know that this will continue to live on in the ICA space. But I'm also hoping that those who are listening or those who are watching this conversation, if you have ideas or if you have strategies or you have concerns or you have suggestions, please do feel free to reach out to any one of us who is on this call, but in particular, Lara Sawyer, who's been our fearless leader in making sure that we have the space to have these kinds of really in-depth conversations. So thank you one and all, and I look forward to seeing you on the next ICA on the Air.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.